The night my own daughter looked me in the eye and called me a burden, I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I just smiled, packed one suitcase, and walked out of that house forever. 18 months later, the same children who threw me away were standing outside my front gate, begging to be let back into my life. MYZ name is Amanda. I'm 72 years old. And this is the story of how I built an empire out of the ashes they left behind. Before I tell you what happened, if you believe nobody is ever truly too old to start over, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel if stories of quiet women finally getting their justice mean something to you. And type in the comments where you're watching from tonight. I read every single one, and I promise you, knowing people all over the world are sitting with me while I tell this story means more to me than you'll ever know. Now let me take you back to where it all began. I want you to understand something before I go any further. I wasn't always the woman sitting alone in a small apartment wondering where I went wrong. I was the woman who held a family together with her bare hands for 40 years. I married young, raised 3 children practically on my own because my husband worked long hours and traveled often. And when he passed away 11 years ago, I didn't fall apart. I couldn't afford to. I had a household to run, grandchildren who still needed me, and a quiet ache in my chest that I learned to carry without ever putting it down in front of anyone. My children grew up in that house. I scrubbed those floors, I sewed curtains by hand because we couldn't always afford new ones. I sat up nights with fevers and report cards and broken hearts. I gave piano lessons on the side just so there would be a little extra for birthdays. I never once made my children feel like a burden, even when life made me feel like one myself. So when my daughter, the eldest of the 3, sat across from me at her dining table 18 months ago and said the words that would change my life forever, I felt something inside me go very, very still. Mom, we've talked about it, and honestly, you're kind of a burden on all of us right now. I had been staying with her for 3 months after a small surgery left me needing help getting around. 3 months. After 40 years of being the one who showed up, who cooked, who nursed, who never once said no when one of them needed something, 3 months was apparently too long. Her husband nodded along like this was a business decision, not a knife being driven into an old woman's chest. My son, sitting at the end of the table scrolling his phone, didn't even look up. My youngest, the one I thought understood me best, just stared at her plate and said nothing at all. Sometimes silence is its own kind of cruelty. We think it might be time you considered other options, my daughter continued, like she was discussing a piece of furniture that no longer fit the room. There are very nice places for people your age. We'll help you look. Other options. Places for people my age. I sat in that chair, 71 years old at the time, and I felt every year of my life rise up in my throat like a wave I had no way of stopping. I want to tell you something. If you're watching this and you've ever been made to feel like you take up too much space in your own family, you are not the burden. You were never the burden. Sometimes the people who say that about you are simply too small to carry the weight of what you've given them. I didn't scream. I didn't cry in front of them, though God knows I wanted to. I simply nodded, finished my tea, and said, I understand. That night, alone in the guest room that had never once felt like mine, I made a decision that would change everything. The next morning, I called a taxi before anyone in that house was awake. I left a short note on the kitchen counter. It said only this: thank you for showing me exactly where I stand. I won't be a burden to anyone again. I had a small savings account my late husband and I had built together over decades. Nothing extravagant, but enough to get me a modest 1-bedroom apartment across town. I had also kept, quietly and without telling a soul, a little hobby I'd nurtured for years. Handmade quilts and embroidery work that I sold occasionally to a local boutique. Never made much. It was something to do with my hands while my heart was busy holding everyone else together. For the first few weeks in that tiny apartment, I'll be honest with you, I grieved. I grieved the family I had raised. I grieved the woman who had given everything and was told it wasn't enough. I sat by my window some nights and wondered if maybe they were right, if maybe I really was just taking up space the world didn't need anymore. But then something shifted in me. Maybe it was anger. Maybe it was just 71 years of quiet strength finally deciding it had nothing left to lose. I thought about every skill I'd built in the shadows of raising other people. The budgeting that stretched pennies into meals for 5, the sewing, the organizing, the patience it takes to manage a household with no help and no thanks. I had spent my whole life being capable and invisible at the same time. So I asked myself one simple question. What if, instead of mourning the life that was taken from me, I built one nobody could ever take away again? I want you to sit with that question too if you're watching tonight. What might you build if you stopped waiting for permission? Almost nothings. I started small. The boutique that sold my quilts agreed to let me set up an online shop using their account. Since I had no idea how computers worked back then, my granddaughter, not one of the three who turned their backs, but a niece's daughter who'd always had a soft spot for me, came over one weekend and taught me how to take photographs of my work, how to write a little description, how to ship a package. Within 2 months, that small online shop was bringing in more than my old monthly budget ever had. People wanted handmade, imperfect, human things again. Quilts with real stitching, real stories behind them. I started sharing little notes with each order, the way I used to write notes in my children's lunchboxes. People loved that. They wrote back. They told me about their own mothers, their own grandmothers, their own complicated families. By month 4, I had more orders than I could fill alone. I hired 2 women from my apartment building, both widows, both written off by their own families in different ways, to help me sew. We worked out of my tiny living room with tea always on the stove. We weren't just making quilts anymore. We were making a community. By month 7, a local news segment about the Grandmothers Quilting Collective brought in a wave of attention I never expected. Orders poured in from across the country. I had to rent a small storefront. I hired 4 more women. I learned slowly and clumsily how to run payroll, how to manage inventory, how to be the kind of leader I'd never been allowed to be in my own family. I won't pretend it was easy. There were nights my hands ached so badly I couldn't hold a needle. There were nights I sat alone in that little office above the shop and cried, missing my children even though they discarded me, because that's what mothers do. We love even the people who hurt us, even when we know better. But I kept going, because for the first time in my life I was building something that was entirely mine. I want to be honest with you about something. I did try to reach out in those early months. I sent my daughter a card on her birthday. I called my son on Father's Day to ask how the children were doing. I wrote my youngest a long letter explaining how much that conversation at the dining table had hurt me, hoping that maybe, just maybe, she would call. Silence. Every single time. It's a particular kind of pain, being ignored by people who once depended on you for everything. I had changed every diaper, sat through every school play, paid for every prom dress out of money I didn't really have. And now I couldn't even get a returned phone call. I stopped reaching out after about the 9th month. Not out of bitterness, but out of self-respect. I had given my whole life to people who decided the moment I needed something back, that I wasn't worth the trouble. I deserved better than chasing affection from people who'd already made their choice clear. So I poured that energy into my work instead. The Quilting Collective became something bigger than I ever imagined. We started offering workshops for other older women in the community who wanted to learn a trade, who wanted purpose, who'd been told by their own families that their best years were behind them. I watched women in their 60s, 70s, even 80s walk into that little shop with their shoulders down and their eyes dim, and walk out months later standing taller than I'd ever seen them stand. I realized something during that time that I want to pass on to you tonight. Being discarded by people who were supposed to love you unconditionally doesn't mean you've lost your worth. Sometimes it just means you've outgrown the smallness they tried to keep you in. By month 14, what started as a few handmade quilts had become a registered small business with 12 employees, a modest but steady wholesale relationship with 3 regional boutiques, and a growing online following that genuinely seemed to care about the story behind every piece we made. I wasn't rich by any extravagant measure, but I was financially secure in a way I had never once been in my entire life. Not as a young wife stretching every dollar, not as a widow living carefully off what little was left behind. More than the money, though, I had something I valued infinitely more. A sense of who I was outside of being someone's mother, someone's wife, someone's burden. It was around month 16 that the messages started. First it was my youngest, a single text. "Mom, we saw the article about your shop. That's amazing. We should talk." Then my son a few weeks later. "Hey Mom, it's been a while. Things have been tough on my end. Could we catch up sometime?" And finally, 2 months after that, my eldest daughter, the one who'd called me a burden at her own dining table, showed up at my shop unannounced. I remember exactly what she looked like standing in that doorway, the bell above it still jingling from when she pushed it open. She looked smaller than I remembered. Or maybe I had simply grown. "Mom," she said, and her voice cracked in a way I hadn't heard since she was a little girl. I didn't know it was this big. I'm so proud of you. I want to tell you, if you've ever wondered what it feels like to hear the words you waited a lifetime for arrive 18 months too late, it's complicated. Part of me wanted to fold her into my arms the way I always had. 40 years of motherhood doesn't simply switch off because someone hurt you. But another part of me, the part that had spent a year and a half rebuilding herself from nothing, simply looked at her and said, "I'm proud of myself too." She asked if we could talk. I agreed, but on my terms, in my shop, surrounded by the women who had become my real family during the time her own family had abandoned me. Over the following weeks, all 3 of my children eventually came to see me, separately, each carrying their own version of an apology. My son admitted that he'd gone along with the conversation that night because he didn't want conflict in his sister's house, that he'd regretted his silence almost immediately but didn't know how to undo it. My youngest cried more than I'd ever seen her cry, telling me she'd thought about that letter I sent every single day since, but pride and shame had kept her from picking up the phone. My eldest, the one who'd actually said the words, took the longest to find anything real to say. When she finally did, she told me that watching me build something so successful, so respected, so entirely my own, had forced her to confront how wrong she'd been, not just about that conversation but about who I was as a person underneath the role of mom. I listened to all of it. I didn't interrupt, and I didn't perform forgiveness I didn't yet feel. I told each of them the same thing in my own way. I am not the same woman who left that house 18 months ago. I am not going to fold myself back into a shape that's comfortable for you. If you want a relationship with me now, it will be with the woman standing in front of you, not the one you discarded. It wasn't easy for them to hear. Some of them are still working through what that means. My relationship with my children today isn't perfect, and I won't pretend on this channel that everything wrapped up into some neat, tidy bow. My son and I talk regularly now, and he's even started helping with the business's finances, something he's surprisingly gifted at. My youngest visits the shop most weekends, and I've watched her slowly rebuild trust the right way, through actions, not apologies. My eldest and I are still finding our footing. Some wounds take longer to close than others, and I've learned that's all right too. What I will tell you is this: the version of me who needed their approval to feel whole doesn't exist anymore. And strangely, that's exactly what made real reconciliation possible. I stopped chasing their love, and somewhere in that stillness, real love had room to grow back on its own terms. Chapter 7. What I want you to take from this. If you've made it this far with me tonight, I imagine some of you are sitting there with your own version of that dining room table moment. Maybe it wasn't your children. Maybe it was a husband, a sibling, a friend you gave everything to. Maybe somebody you loved made you feel small, made you feel like your presence was an inconvenience rather than a gift. I want you to hear this from a 72-year-old woman who has lived through it. It is never too late to choose yourself. I didn't start that quilting business because I had some grand vision of success or revenge. I started it because I refused to let one cruel sentence define the rest of my life. I refused to shrink myself down to fit inside someone else's definition of my worth. There is a strange kind of grace in being underestimated. People stop watching you closely. They stop expecting anything from you. And in that quiet, overlooked space, you have all the room in the world to grow into something they never saw coming. I am not telling you to cut everyone off who hurts you. Life is rarely that simple, and forgiveness, when it's real and earned, can be one of the most healing things we ever do. What I am telling you is that your worth was never up for debate in the first place. You don't have to prove it by building an empire the way I did. Sometimes the quietest version of reclaiming yourself is enough. A new hobby, a new friendship, a boundary you finally hold for the first time in your life. I think about that dining room table often. I think about how small I felt sitting in that chair, how certain I was that maybe they were right, that maybe 71 years old really was too old to matter anymore. And I think about the woman I am now, standing in a shop full of fabric and laughter and women who remind me every single day that we are never finished, not at any age. To my children, if you ever watch this, I love you. I have always loved you, even in the silence, even in the hurt. But I will never again let anyone's definition of my worth become smaller than the truth of who I am. And to every single one of you watching tonight, wherever you are in the world, whatever table you're sitting at right now, however old you are and however unseen you feel, I want you to know that your story isn't finished either. Somewhere inside you is a quilting shop, a business, a new beginning, a version of yourself nobody has met yet, because you haven't given her the chance. Don't wait until someone calls you a burden to find out how strong you really are. If this story meant something to you tonight, I'd be so grateful if you'd hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Tell me about your own table moment if you have one. I read every comment and I promise you, your story matters to me just as much as mine matters to you. Until next time, take care of yourselves and never let anyone convince you that you're too much or not enough. You are exactly enough. You always were. This is Amanda signing off.